see you.
Nice to see you too. So I've been thinking about you just because I think you and I talked that the atmosphere in the States it's a, well, I think it seems like we're also connected now. We sort of understand a little bit about what's going on in different parts of the world, but it's very intense with the election coming up, and there's been an enormous racial reckoning here, with our history of slavery and Jim Crow and the sustained experience of people of color, particularly Black people, of being, disenfranchised and not able to really participate. And there's some kind of reckoning that's trying to happen. And you and I talked about it just in passing, but I feel like it's a question that you've entertained and you've looked at very carefully. I think that you've shared with me some of your thoughts about kind of German culture and the tremendous impact that the war and the rise of Nazism had and the Holocaust has had on your culture. And yet there has been some ways in which it seems like, at least from afar, that German culture has been more prepared to deal with itself, you might say. And I was just curious to open up that conversation with you and get your thoughts.
The first thought I had, no, I don't think that the German culture was more prepared to deal with itself at all. The main difference maybe is it was more forced to. And that had an effect. But when we talk about the German karma, what happened around the Second World War, the first response of the German culture was complete neglect for decades, more or less. It didn't really start before 68, really, that something started. And then it started as a generation conflict. The whole 68 movement in Germany was very much about one slogan that I think you also had in the US, but it meant something different here. Don't trust anyone beyond 30.
Over 30. That's right. I think I remember Mick Jagger saying that too.
Yeah. So that had a particular connotation here. And
meaning,
of course,
don't trust anybody who was in leadership during that period of history.
Don't trust anyone who was old enough to be involved.
In any way.
In any way.
Yeah.
And of course, this was also an easy position to take for the young people, because when you take this position, you're already on the winner side, because you can blame your parents.
Yes, that's right. You're virtuous and you're one up.
Virtuous just by the fact of blaming.
Yeah.
And that didn't work either, which also created that the progressive movement in Germany was maybe one of the most intense ones at that time in the 70s, including the left-wing terrorism. I don't know if you remember the Red Army faction.
I don't, actually.
Basically, they started to kidnap people and kill them.
Wow. I don't remember that at all.
Oh yeah,
wow.
It was a big movement. In fact, with a lot of support.
And what was its intention? What was the motive for the kidnapping?
To kidnap the bad capitalist leaders, imperialist leaders, all the guilty ones, the ones who supported the war in Vietnam and things like that. So
it was a progressive movement driven by liberal values, but it had a very radical. It became quite radical. Yeah. And
quite some similarities with fascism. Interesting enough.
Yeah. It's interesting how that happens.
Yeah. So it just happens. So it's just not the case that the Germans were in any way better prepared, but there was something that Germany was and still is in a very particular situation, that literally the whole world was pointing the finger and said, you have to deal with this.
Well, let's just pause there for 1 second. So what I'm hearing you say is that after the war, that until the 70s, that the culture basically was in denial in some ways around being willing in a certain way to look at, to take responsibility, and probably maybe even, I'm guessing, this I'd like to hear your response to this before we talk about the world's pressure, but just dealing with the pain of it. Like this sort of, I'm imagining that the relationship of kind of pushing it away and coping and putting one foot in front of the other was also simply survival. I mean, would that be fair?
I think it's good you're bringing this up, because of being progressive in the 70s myself, what I was talking about, maybe not to that extreme, but partly I was talking about myself.
Okay.
I was very kind of pointing the finger to German, in my case, Austrian fascism, Nazism, same thing. And now I see this slightly different. Now I see it quite different. The fact is, 1945, everything was destroyed in Germany. And with everything, I don't mean that the industry was destroyed, the city was destroyed, our values were destroyed, our soul was destroyed. We are confronted, basically, that we as a culture were part of something that was unbelievable beyond imagination. And I do have some understanding that this was for the moment, and with the moment I mean the first decades, just too much to deal with, just too much. And I really think one has to consider this, that even if you were involved in that and whatever, to let that in, or that your country is destroyed, you were defeated in the war, but you are defeated in who you are as a human being, or what to believe in. And this is a very devastating situation to be in. And to reckon with this, the easiest way is just basically forget about it, and now we have to rebuild the economy. And let's do this. And that's basically what Germany did. And
let's just if nothing else, let's become functional. And maybe even it's a certain kind of intelligence in the human experience that just puts one foot in front of the other.
So I started to see this in this way, but only recently. And in that sense, you're very right. One has to also have mercy with the fact that when you commit a huge crime, you have to deal with it, and that's not easy either. It doesn't take anything away. I don't say to have pity with the people who committed the crime, but just be aware that they are also humans, and they have to deal with it, and they have to learn how to deal with it. And to some degree, I think Germany was able to do so. At least some parts of German society were able to do so. What's happening right now is also very complicated. There is a rising far right in Germany who try to kind of change this again. And also this is complicated, but something came out of this to a big degree because there was no way out.
Right. So maybe we can pick up right there, because I think that relates to some degrees to our situation in the States. So to pick up right there, you said the reason that one of the things I think that's remarkable about German culture is, I can think of very few examples where a culture has built a monument to its own error, its own very grave mistake, as you say. So the Holocaust Memorial in Berlin is evidence of, or at least symbolic gesture towards owning what happened, but you're saying that that wasn't voluntary, that a lot of pressure came to bear on the German people. So do you want to talk about that a little more? I'm curious about that.
I mean, it was voluntary and not, because it was done because of the German parliament making the decision to do so. And that did voluntarily. It had a huge debate, not only in parliament, but in the whole society. There was a huge confrontation about it. Many people really hated having this monument. And having this conflict was a good one, because it forced the German nation to look at it and find the right way how to deal with this. And it in fact had a very surprising, powerful effect to have this monument in the center of Berlin, next to the German Reichstag, which is the German parliament, next to the place where the German chancellor has his office, has her office. So it's really in the center of the political life, not just of Berlin. It's at the center of the political life of Germany as a nation.
Would you say something about how the pressures came from the outside and forced the parliament to start to recognize and deal with this in its own process? And it sounds like you said it was a good conflict, but how did the external conflicts come, or external pressures come to bear? Like, in what form?
I mean, it started directly at the Second World War, that, for example, the US Army forced the German population to go to the cinema and watch documentary of the films of the liberation of the concentration camps and what the US Army saw there. So they didn't voluntarily go there. They had to go there just to see.
I didn't know that happened. Wow.
The whole cities had to go to the cinema and watch it, watch Auschwitz, watch Dachau, and watch what was on camera at the Liberation Day of Auschwitz and Dachau, and see it. And then Germany was also part of an alliance with Western values, and also it was in confrontation. It was in confrontation with the Soviet bloc. And the confrontation with the East and the West was also a confrontation about values. So there was a competition between East Germany and West Germany. How do we deal with our past? Because the communist East Germany, they had a very easy way out. They said, we are the communists, we were the victims too. The bad ones, the Nazi ones, this is West Germany.
Okay.
So West Germany had to deal with the fact that somehow they had to prove that, no, we are not the same. We are not Nazi Germany, we are different Germany. We are a democratic nation, and we want to deal with what happened. And out of all different internal, external, also political constellation situations like the Cold War, there was a lot of public education. So, for example, I myself, I'm Austrian, but Austria during the Second World War was part of Germany, and Hitler was Austrian, so Austria is more than involved in all of this. I, as a kid, I think when I was 8 years old, like every Austrian school kid, we had to go to the concentration camp and see it. We all had to go there and see this as part of our education. And we were just confronted because this was part of public education. So there was a whole transformation of culture to be very aware of what happened. But at the same time, you can also fake this. You can also basically create a political correct culture around this. And that's to a big degree what happened. But at the same time, there was enough of a layer in German society, particularly in German society, more than in Austrian society. It's a story in itself, where people really let it in. And I know that many psychotherapists in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and ever since say, basically, it's an exaggeration, but basically in every therapy at some point, you hit the Second World War.
You hit the collective trauma.
You hit the collective trauma, and it comes up. And so there was a lot going on, and there was also a lot going on form of therapy in spiritual therapy. You remember Osho? You know that Osho basically to 80% was a German event. 80% of his students were German.
Oh, I had no idea. No, didn't know.
Because he was
in India or in the
everywhere,
States?
everywhere in the States, everywhere. Okay. Basically, wow. it was a majority of people joining Osho were Germans. Wow. Because he was this liberation. Also, you understand a lot of the Osho movement when you see this psychological dynamics of the Germans kind of feeding it. To liberate yourself and have these dynamic meditations and this catharsis and all this kind. So there's just a lot of culture, and I mean, of course, a lot went wrong with Osho also. This is interesting itself, but to see there was just a lot of process in many ways, where the culture over many years, out of partly being forced to, partly being forced to by inner forces, meaning when you deal with your psychology and you end up there, you somehow at least are pressured to deal with this.
I would imagine there was some pressures too from France, from Belgium, from other places on the continent.
Of course, everywhere. I mean, it's very easy to say the Germans love to go on vacation somewhere. But in Europe, everywhere where they went, they were confronted with the Second World War. And I was, when I was a teenager, I often went to holiday in Greece. The first thing I made clear there that I'm not German, I'm Austrian.
Which is kind of paradoxical, as you say.
It's kind of paradoxical, but it worked.
It worked, yeah.
It worked. And I had a much better deal. I had much better relationship. I spoke German, but I'm not German, I'm Austrian. So basically all this karmic pressure was not on my shoulders. So I very much made sure I'm not. And this, of course, the Germans could not go there. As an Austrian, I had this kind of, I'm not this, I'm the other. And this created something that allowed a maturation process also to happen. And in that sense, I think you're right. Something did happen. And I think that there's a maturity in the German culture that is important. And I say this particular, I'm in an easier position to say so because I'm not completely German, I'm Austrian. And I have to say, and I can say that it is not the same in Austria. So I have an outsider perspective on this. And there's something in the German society that is just a maturity that you also have as an individual when you have looked into your own abyss.
Yes. And your own shadow.
In your own shadow, exactly.
Yeah, it's like what I hear you saying is that to be German is to be in relationship to the part of oneself that we don't want to see or think about or feel. But there was really no escape, that one had to do that. I mean, I'm guessing the earlier generations did less of it in a way, just because of that coping and kind of trying to, but now it seems that there's a lot of, certainly in the work I've done, and I know our colleague Thomas Hubel is doing a lot of work on really touching into owning, transmuting this collective harm.
No, that's definitely the case. I mean, one also has to say, you also can overdo this and
Sure.
can make a politically correct thing out of this. Also, this is happening. So
Yeah,
there's a
sure.
dialect,
I know. I'm very
there's a
intimate with
dialectic
that.
in all directions. But in the core of it, I think it's something very wholesome and something powerful. And ironically, it's something that Germany as a culture can give now.
Well, that's why I wanted to talk to you, because I feel that the U.S. has these histories of atrocity, and that they're not well integrated, and that Native people, indigenous people who live here, and people who are, born through the legacy of slavery who live here, and even, Asians who came here, who worked on the railroad and were laborers in the early part of this country, or Latin people. We haven't. It seems like we're starting to begin in a way, but I thought it would be interesting to have this conversation, because person to person, I'm just curious what advice you would give to me or other people like me who are interested in actually doing what you've done.
I mean, the US is in a very interesting situation because, of course, the US is not Germany. The US did not commit the crime of the Holocaust. But a lot happened in the US that is also something that comes to light now. Comes to light now out of different reasons. One reason is, right now we're in a very interesting time. In a very interesting time, I mean, in a very specific context, we have been living in a time of 500 years of European domination of the world context since the European colonization. Where basically all what is happening around the globe was more and more seen to a European perspective and contextualized by a European perspective.
Yeah, colonialism.
Colonialism and neocolonialism and post-colonialism, all of it, until now. Our understanding of what a free world is based on European values and European contextualization, which is very different than an Indian one or a Chinese one.
European sensibilities. Yeah.
And this won't work anymore because the powers are shifting somewhere else. And there's a lot under the carpet from European colonialism. There's a lot under the carpet. What happened in India, what happened in China, what happened in Africa, what happened in South America, that we mostly are not aware of, but everyone else is.
Yeah.
And we kind of are aware of that this is the case, enough to be afraid of. And America, for the good or the bad, at least since the First World War, was the leading light of the Western culture. And also has pride in this, because, I mean, the American story is unbelievable from what happened 300 years ago and what the Americans made out of this. It's a powerful story, but it's also based on slavery. It's also based on genocide. It's also based on colonialism. It's also based on imperialism.
It's also based on modernism and industrialization.
Exactly.
The material success is born of industrialization and now technology.
And our time is also an interesting time right now, particularly in the US context, because you are literally at the point where the Europeans become a minority in your own country. And there's a lot to understand, I think, from the kind of anxious response from the white working class, that whatever they were, they at least were white. They were not the billionaires. They were not the celebrities. They were not rich. They had a hard life, but at least they were white.
Mm-hmm.
But this is changing right now, that at least you are white doesn't count anymore. And there's a lot all of a sudden opening up. And it's hard, particularly because those are usually not they were not on the winning side of history necessarily. They had a hard time also. So it's very easy to kind of see yourself as a victim. In some degree, that's true also, but there is also the Black history in the US. There's also the Native American history in the US, and to see all of that and then be blamed by this.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think there's another dimension too, Thomas, which is that as the idealization of what the United States is breaks down, and the cultures differentiate and they become more and more specific, people collapse into their own small groups to find identity. It's so differentiated in terms of culture that it's very difficult to find one worldview, one meme to participate in. So and in some ways, I think Trump has given a way for people to identify with a particular thing, like you say. When the church isn't really available anymore, people's jobs don't have the same identity. It used to be when you worked for the Ford factory, that itself was an identity that isn't there in the same way. So that he's offering an identity and a value set and a way of understanding the world that people can relate to.
Exactly. And if there's something I think to learn from Germany, from this, I think that the most important thing is just that there is something possible in this difficult situation.
Mm-hmm.
That in a situation where you're confronted with all the things that you don't want to be confronted with, seem to lose everything that you want to hold on to, that there is a story, let's put it that way, maybe that's an interesting way to put it, there's a story to be told. That this, which is really the complete breakdown of everything in the culture, what happened to Germany.
But the story that's going to be told can no longer be the idealized story.
No, the story that can be told is that facing your own shadow can bring light.
There's an article today, I think, in the New York Times, and I think it's by one of the op-ed people, and basically he says, if I can find it quickly, he basically says, how can I believe in America again? He's expressing this kind of fall from grace, and this collapse of the sort of American value set, that he put so much of his, I'm looking for it and I'm not really finding it, but basically, he's basically saying, even if Biden wins the election, so much has been lost in the last 4 years, how can I believe again? And I think what I'm hearing you say is, by being willing to let go and by being willing to actually confront and be fully available to the underbelly of the culture that's exposed itself. We have exposed, in a certain way, you could say the shadow of America has been in full view. It's been operating in the background, but it's been in full view to everybody over the last 4 years. It's very painful.
Yeah. And I think there's no way around the pain. And particularly talking to people who have some consciousness about this, I think it's important to be aware of the pain, also particular of the pain of the people who don't have consciousness. And at the same time, to not compromise in some way, but to be human at the same time in the process that is necessary right now. Because it's very easy to be on the righteous side of things.
That's a good point.
It's very easy. And not to oversee the point that this is very often also the easy way out.
Somehow that's not me.
That's not me, and all of a sudden everything is okay. Basically, all the baggage is on the enemy side, and I am the good side of history, and somehow, but reality is more complex than this. Mm-hmm. And I'm really talking. I would like to say to us, to our cultural meme, who has some understanding of what the downsides of American and modernist European cultures are, and also know that something new has to happen here, and we have to find it ourselves, and the way to do it is very much also to learn, to listen to the others, to the other cultures, particularly cultures that we have suppressed. Mm-hmm. But also to talking about the Rust Belt and talking about the white working class, to be aware that we have to be there for them too, in all of this. Because one thing, and that's happening right now all over the place, is when things become very insecure and the pressure goes up, of course, everyone tends to look for easy solutions. And right-wing populism is not as strong in Germany as in other European nations out of these historic reasons, but it's happening too. Mm-hmm. Crazy things like QAnon, of course, is mostly happening in the US, but the second place where it's happening is the UK, and the third place where it's happening is Germany. Mm. And to see, I mean, that there are a lot of complex questions why this is and what this is, but just to see, we are in an unbelievable unknown situation right now. We are in an unbelievable unknown situation. And what it needs is that we develop a kind of resilience or soul capacity to stay in the unknown. And I think if you ask me, so what can we learn from Germany in this? Mm-hmm. To some degree, I always come back not too much because Germany is in the same boat. But there's something that Germany had to go to very self-confronting places, mm-hmm. And something happened that is positive. Mm-hmm. Somehow, I think because Germany was so extreme in its own imperialism, and it was confronted by all the other Western nations by what the atrocities they did, that Germany had to go through, to some degree at least, to a process of self-confrontation that we all have to go through as Western leading cultures right now. So maybe there's something to learn because Germany, ironically, had to pioneer a process of soul confrontation with itself that we as the West have to do as a whole. But of course, Germany did something in that, but there's so much more for all of us that includes also Germany right now. We have to see this. But the good thing, I think, and it gives me soul strength, that I know how difficult this was and is for the Germans. Mm-hmm. And I know to some degree, at least, it was possible. And something mature, human, more human at least, comes out of this. And to have this as an example, as a story, I think is important to see, because you need something like this, because we need a way forward.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Let's talk for just a minute. So what I'm hearing you say is that a willingness to acknowledge the pain and to have the confidence that by being with the pain, and you could call it the disassembling, maybe the disassembling of the myth, of the idealization, and entering into the unknown, that something positive emerges. There's a strength that actually emerges from that. And you pointed to earlier, and maybe this is another place to point it out, that there also can form an attachment to a kind of self-serving virtue that could be translated as political correctness, that now you found this way, and so you're going to somehow again put yourself outside of it by having done it right. So say a little something about how you've experienced the political correctness of this dilemma, if you wouldn't mind.
I mean, the political correctness of this dilemma relates very much to what I said about the progressive culture in Germany since the 70s, where we, on one hand, I think we did a good job in confronting our culture with I know the conversations I had in my home with my father, with my mother. I know the conversations we had in school, and the demonstrations we were on against our father's generation and against the people in power, basically being all Nazis and all fascists, and that was our terminal. So there's something okay with this, but it came with a certainty of being on the right side of things that created its own mirror of what we were fighting against in us.
It's very delicate because one needs to form a powerful position that's against that, and yet that position also can recapitulate this exact same dynamics. That's the challenge.
And that happened in many ways. Well, I mean, some people did this political thing and political correctness thing. The other same generation did the Osho thing.
Right. Kind of a spiritual bypass, would you say?
Spiritual bypass, having liberation, having catharsis. And what did they end up with? They ended up with a Führer.
Right. That's right. I never thought about that. Jeez, that's funny. Never thought about that.
They had again the Führer they really could trust in, and there was some healing in this. That now you have your guru. It's not your Führer, it's your guru. But basically, it's very similar. It's very different.
And they didn't have it for long. I mean,
they didn't have it
collapsed.
for long. Yeah, because as if I may quote Karl Marx, history always happens twice. First as a tragedy and second as a comedy.
That's right. That's right. First as a tragedy and the second as a comedy. Yep. Well, I think there's something about the German experience of the war that, if I could say so, has a kind of a container around it. Whereas American culture and the atrocities and the sustained damage of othering and the racism, has taken place in the evolution of as you were saying, the last 400, 300, 200 years. And slavery has a boundary around it. The genocide, you might say, of the Native Americans has a kind of a boundary around it, but it makes it in some ways harder because it's sort of more integrated with the evolution of the culture. In a way, it's harder to just say, whoa, 1939 to 1945, that was a bad phase. It's sort of more embedded in a way with American success as well. I mean, and again, industrialization, after the war, that's what made America such a superpower, is that we ramped up for industrialization. And then there we were, with our factories and our production. So it's tricky. It's a tricky situation.
It's tricky also because America stands as America for more than America. It stands for our modernist European values and what we created in the world, including the climate collapse. And this is something to, we, and with this we, I mean all the Western cultures, we have to deal with the fact that the way we deal with the world, how we learn to deal with the world, the way what you made out of the world, basically making the world a product to buy and sell. Let's put it that way.
Right. A commodity.
A commodity. That this is something that did something to the world, because something that we cannot sell, like the air, by its nature does not have value the way we constructed the world. So there's a whole deconstruction process going on right now, where the US is at the helmet of this, just because America is the leading culture in all of this.
Right.
But,
and we would love to talk about how the world's greatest economy, but
yes,
the greatest capacity for making the world a commodity.
So does have America the soul strength to face reality in this way, that we as Americans/Europeans have created something that has, I don't want to make it only bad. There's a lot of good things about modernity and Western democratic values. There's a lot of great things, but something comes to an end here, and has to be seen new, and we have to come to terms with it. And particularly the powers in power, and that includes more the US than Germany right now, have to deal with this. And that takes a lot for people in government, but it takes a lot for a whole culture to see that everything that we love, that we stand for, your love for the American flag, that is deep and emotional value. I know it from my time in the US. It's basically in your guts, it's in your heart, your relationship to your flag. But this relationship to the flag stands for a set of values that's deeply related to what's going on in the world. And how can we how can we loosen that up in a way that something new can come out of this, in a situation that, with the virus crisis, with all the crises that we have right now, is tremendously challenging. So it's a huge demand on all of us and on our soul strength to have mercy with us, to have a deep understanding, a critical understanding of us and others, and to find new perspectives that can integrate what we need to do.
And I would say one advantage that I think you have as German, Austrian culture is there is a humility. Yes. For as amazing as German people, Austrian people are in terms of your intellectual tradition, your artistic tradition, your capacity as engineers, as organizers, there's still a deep humility that comes from the war. And I don't think that the US has that. I mean, we certainly have historical reasons that we should be, but as a collective, I would say we're filled with pride and arrogance. I mean, the Americans are known for arrogance, and how that's why even with this election, as much as I'm very coherent in my support for Joe Biden because he's fundamentally an ethical human being. Mm-hmm. But there is a little bit of looking backwards in his candidacy. There's a little bit of thinking that we can kind of regain something. And I don't know. I feel like we have to go through something, and I don't know quite how we're going to do it. Particularly given our size and our complexity as a culture, we're so complex and diverse. we don't have that coherence now. We're so differentiated. It's very challenging.
No, thank you for that. Maybe if you want to break it down to one word, all the maturity that I talked about, mm-hmm. it only comes down to the capacity for humility. Mm-hmm. And also, not to go too far with this, mm-hmm. Germany is not a humble culture. Mm-hmm. It's not. But there's a crack. Mm-hmm. That's it. There's a crack, and there's some layers of society that honor and appreciate the crack. Mm-hmm. It's not much more. I don't think anyone in America would believe that Germany is a humble culture. It is not, but it's in some way, it's a difficult word, but it's a broken culture.
Well, yeah, I was going to say that, but there is something in my experience of German friends, colleagues, people I've worked with, that the crack, I feel it and I experience it as a kind of humility. I feel it in you, yeah. Certainly. Yeah.
I run a magazine in Germany. I do a magazine called the Wolf Magazine, and we did the last issue about beauty. And by doing this magazine, we had an interview with a Japanese a professor for aesthetics about the Japanese concept of beauty that you probably know, wabi-sabi. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And the reason why I bring this in, because it's so different to the European Greek mm-hmm. understanding of beauty as perfection.
Perfection, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Wabi-sabi is the beauty, for people who don't know that, when you break a cup, that you put it together, and where the cracks are, you golden the cracks so that the cracks become part of the beauty. And the same is about our pride, that the broken pride there's something beautiful when you appreciate the brokenness in the right way, not in the wrong way.
In the right way, I understand.
That makes the culture more beautiful, because it appreciates its cracks in this. And that's maybe the beauty that you're talking about, that you experience maybe at least in some parts of Germany.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think that's a really beautiful place for us to end, actually, to end our conversation. I just really want to thank you for being willing to talk to me about this, because it has been on my mind, and you've been on my mind, and I just wanted to ask what you think. And I really appreciate you for sharing.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.